Michael Denner, a legend who does not appear in the roar of the stage, but hides himself in moments so small they are easy to overlook. People once caught him standing silently in a small record store in Copenhagen, his hand gently brushing the dust off an old vinyl, his eyes sinking into a distant space, as if he were listening again to sounds only he could hear. Few would believe that this quiet man was the guitarist who created the first chapters that shaped heavy metal, one half of the soul of Mercyful Fate, the one behind the razor-sharp riffs of Melissa, Don't Break the Oath, and a series of projects that earned the respect of the entire metal community. This very paradox is the starting point of the story. How could the icon of one of the most important bands of the 80s become so tranquil? Where did music take him? And what did it take away? The journey of Michael Denner is not only the story of a guitarist, it is the life of a man who always stood between two worlds, between the dazzling lights and the long stretches of silence, between the feverish applause and the doubts that never turned into words. Every choice he made, leaving the band, returning, forming new groups, and then disappearing again, carried the price of being honest with himself. In the quiet moments that few people notice, we can see another Michael Denner, not the heavy metal icon towering on stage, but the man trying to keep the part of himself from being swallowed by sound. So what truly happened to this man? And what made music somehow never let go of him? Michael's life did not begin in the darkness of metal, but in the warm yellow light of a small apartment, where his first influence was not a stage legend, but his own father, a quiet yet passionate blues guitarist. Many mornings, Michael woke up to the deep, sorrowful sound of his father's guitar. Old blues riffs, long bends like the whispers of a man who was not good at expressing his emotions. No one called it a guitar lesson, but for young Denner, that was his first class, where he learned to listen and let music seep into him like breath. His family was not well off, but the house was full of instruments. His father's old Fender, a self-made amp, guitar strings always available on the table. Every evening, the two of them sat in front of the old player. The father closed his eyes to the rhythm, while young Michael recorded every riff from Hendrix, Cream, Peter Green, Led Zeppelin, Blue Cheer, the first bricks that built proto-metal. Michael had no formal schooling. He learned by watching his father's hand slide along the neck, then imitating, then turning it into his own sound. Music came to Denner not only from family closeness, but also from loneliness. The small room in Copenhagen, with an old radio serving as a window to the world, became the place where he first heard Hendrix and Black Sabbath. No one taught him that it was rock or metal. Only instinct told him he belonged to that sound. For hours, he sat rewinding riffs again and again, writing them down in an old notebook until the player warmed up. That was not practice. It was his way of escaping the sense of displacement in everyday life. During the evenings when father and son sat silently listening to Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, or Peter Green, another thing quietly formed: the ability to sense the darkness in music, not the darkness of aggression or rebellion, but the darkness of depth, of the quiet emotion only sensitive souls can hear clearly. That later became the underlying current of Denner's music, shaping the identity of Mercyful Fate. Michael Denner grew up in a family where music was not a profession, but a bloodstream. From that foundation, between his father's quietness, the sweet sadness of blues nights, the Sabbath recordings that sent shivers through him, an introverted, curious, and somewhat lonely boy began forming his own musical identity, the one that would change heavy metal forever. Michael Denner stepped onto a path no one could have guessed would later place him at the center of one of the most important early chapters in metal history. In his teenage years, Michael carried a very ordinary fear. He was afraid of the dark. Not the instinctive childhood fear, but a lingering unease lasting into his early 20s. Fear of overly quiet nights, fear of the demonic sensations the mind projected into the dark. Even though he later stood under blazing red lights, playing riffs the world associated with satanic imagery, young Michael Denner was the boy who did not dare walk too long down a dark hallway after turning off the lights. A small paradox, but enough for fans to call it a cruel joke of fate. The man who once feared the dark became one of the founders of a music where darkness is the heart. During the evenings, sitting with his father in the warm, yellow-lit apartment, Michael gradually stepped into another world, harsher, louder, and more demanding than any dreamy teenager could imagine. In the late teenage years, early 20s, he began diving into music, not as a hobby, but as the only path that made sense. 6 days a week, he carried a cheap copy of a Flying V, crossing Copenhagen to reach old rehearsal rooms deep in industrial blocks. This was the period when his life was compressed to the simplest form possible. Struggling to eat, no money for bus fare, often making fake passes or sneaking onto trains. All just to reach the place where he and a few friends could stand in a freezing room, plug into amps, and play until their fingers burned. There was no promise of success. No one guaranteed where those riffs would lead them. But Michael kept doing it, quietly, persistently, almost devoutly. For him, music at that time was no longer joy, but the only thing keeping him steady through the uncertain years of youth. At the end of the 1970s, Michael Denner was struggling between long rehearsal sessions and the hardships of life in Copenhagen, and a new shape of music gradually appeared around him. In the old rehearsal hallways where exposed wires ran along the walls and the amps crackled like the breath of a tired person, Bratz began to take form. Here, Denner and Hank Shermann tinkered with a hybrid sound between punk and hard rock, sharp as the edge of a blade, rough yet full of vitality, carrying the stubbornness of those who did not know how to compromise. In 1980, the culmination of that period became Bratz, their first album. It was not polished, not calculated to please anyone, but it carried a rare primal energy. During this period, the contrasting pair of Flying V guitars, one bright, one dark, first appeared before the public, creating a visual and sonic mark that later became part of Denner's legacy. As the light began to rise, the darkness of reality immediately fell upon them. CBS, viewing the band purely through a market lens, began applying pressure, write more accessible songs, sing in Danish to suit local tastes, abandon the sharp edges, and move closer to the masses. For Michael and Hank, those demands were nothing less than an invitation to abandon the very soul of their music. They refused, quietly but firmly. The price came immediately after. Bratz disbanded. One chapter closed to make way for the next, where Denner's music would become heavier, darker, and more important than anything he had ever touched before. It was the first time Michael confronted the truth that art is not only creation, it is struggle. And sometimes, to keep one's identity, the artist must choose the path that costs them everything. But from that collapse, something else began to spark. A sound heavier, darker, more demanding. A sound that would soon bear the name Mercyful Fate. The breakup of Bratz did not drag Michael to the bottom. It was like a push that sent him into a new realm, where the light was stronger, the darkness deeper, and music was no longer just a livelihood, but destiny. In 1981, in a small rehearsal room in Copenhagen, Michael Denner, Hank Shermann, and King Diamond unexpectedly found a meeting point within differences that seemed impossible to reconcile. King brought a satanic philosophy like a new aesthetic. Hank brought the ambition to push rock into unexplored territory, and Michael, whose guitar instincts were both dark and lyrical, brought a depth of emotion no one else could create. From that moment, Mercyful Fate was not just formed, it emerged like an initiation ritual. There was no contract, only a strange shared feeling they all recognized. They were creating a kind of metal that had never existed in Denmark, a sound carrying darkness as instinct, twin guitar structures as complex as a labyrinth, and an occult aesthetic so striking it made the entire underground stop and listen. When the 1982 EP appeared, the world heard for the first time a form of harmony that followed no conventional pattern. The riffs cut abruptly, the song structures twisted into each other like haunted triangles, and the two guitars, Denner and Hank, did not play like two musicians side by side, but like two souls conversing in the dark. The harmonized passages they created were not just beautiful, they were challenging, haunting, and opened a new language for heavy metal. Everything before that had merely been a prelude. In 1983, Melissa was born, and every boundary was shattered. The album was not just heavy, it was dangerous in the musical sense, daring to push metal into depths that at the time only Venom or Bathory dared to reach. The arrival of Melissa was like the first crack in the ground. Once opened, beneath it lay the entire future of extreme metal. It was no coincidence that the PMRC placed Into the Coven on the Filthy 15 list. They felt threatened. But it was during this moment that Michael Denner emerged as half the soul of Mercyful Fate's sound. Every solo, every chord shift he played was razor sharp, but never cold. Instead, it carried the primal resonance of someone who understood that darkness was not meant to frighten, but to illuminate the hidden essence of humanity. Only a year later, in 1984, Don't Break the Oath appeared, and if Melissa opened the gates of hell, then this album turned hell into a theater. Here, Denner's harmonic structures reached an unmistakable maturity. Solos like blades of light cutting through darkness, twin harmonies tight as drawn bows, and an elegance in the way he responded to every shriek of King Diamond that made guitarists bow their heads. This was the period when Denner was not just good, he defined a style. The tours in the US and Germany turned Mercyful Fate into a living legend. On stage, Michael Denner did not posture, did not scream. He stood still, the bright flying V pressed to his chest, producing sounds that left thousands of metal fans frozen in awe. It was during these years, 1983 to 1985, that he reached his peak, not only in technique, but in identity. Everything converged. The guitar intuition from childhood, the monk-like poverty during the Bratz years, the defiance against CBS, and now the vast world opening before him. This was the era when anyone who encountered Michael Denner described him with two words: irreplaceable. But the light often burns brightest just before it dies. At the end of 1985, musical differences between Hank and King became an irreparable fracture. Hank wanted to move toward a softer pop metal direction. King Diamond refused any compromise. Michael, who had witnessed, accompanied, and helped build everything, was pushed into the middle of his two closest friends. And then, in silence, he chose to leave. Not because he wanted to, but because in that position, every choice meant loss. It was the first cut. The moment he was torn away from the very creation into which he had poured his youth, his blood, and his darkness. But it was also from this golden era that the greatest legacy of Michael Denner took shape. A sound that later thrash, death, and black metal would look back upon and bow in gratitude. When the door of Mercyful Fate closed, Michael did not fall into a void. He stepped immediately into another chapter with his closest brothers. In 1985, King Diamond and Timmy Hansen came to him with a proposal that was simple yet weighty. "We don't want to stop." And so the King Diamond Band was formed, not to repeat the past, but to test each person's identity in a new space. For Michael, this was both a continuation and a necessary rebirth. They recorded Fatal Portrait in early 1986, an album that opened a new bright territory in King's career and was also where Michael expressed a refinement different from his Mercyful Fate years. The music at this point was less labyrinthine, less ritualistic, but more theatrical. And Denner adjusted his guitar tone accordingly, like a storyteller using the instrument to touch the softer corners of the soul. The true peak of this journey appeared in 1987 with Abigail. In the eyes of many metal fans, this was not only the best album of King Diamond, it was considered one of the greatest concept albums in the entire history of metal. Abigail operated like a miniature Gothic novel, a complete, pitch-black story, both tragic and dramatic, opening in 1777 and flowing into 1845. All of it was woven together by King's chilling falsetto and layers of guitar that shifted scenes like blades of steel cutting through darkness. At the heart of that ambitious structure, Michael Denner was not simply playing guitar. He became the one who shaped the emotional core of the entire story. Each of his solos felt like an extended breath inside a haunted house, each harmony like a trace of tragedy lingering on old walls. The eeriness, the sorrow, and the haunting quality in his playing did not merely embellish the album. They became part of the soul that kept Abigail alive for decades. This was one of the rare periods in which he was both creatively free and at the peak of his craft. But just as the band reached its most explosive moment, Michael chose to leave, not because of conflict, nor because he ran out of ideas, simply because he saw something the others still standing in the spotlight could not see. Real life was knocking on the door. Yet just as Abigail propelled the King Diamond Band to its brightest peak, Michael Denner chose to step out. The decision sounded paradoxical, leaving at the very moment the entire metal world was looking toward him. But in truth, for Michael, it was one of the rare times he was forced to confront the limits of his own humanity. The years 1985 and 1987 with King Diamond were not only a period of explosive creativity, they were also days of exhaustion, packed recording schedules, endless tours, and the pressure to constantly outdo oneself. Michael was the type of artist who could not survive on chaos. He needed space, quiet, and a real rhythm of life to stay balanced. Beneath the blinding spotlight, he felt a persistent fatigue, not from the music, but from the pace at which the industry was moving. King Diamond's music at that time demanded ever more theatricality, spectacle, and complexity. It suited King, a natural showman, but it made Michael feel he was being pulled away from the simple, instinctive essence of his guitar voice. He once said that he was not a man of theatrical stages, and that became increasingly true. Gradually, Michael understood that if he continued along this trajectory, he would lose the part of himself from which his music had originally been born. And then, the decision was made. After the tour and the masterpiece Abigail, Michael left the band, not because of disagreement and not because of creative depletion, but because of a deeply human need to return to being Michael Denner, rather than a cog in a machine running at a terrifying speed. Leaving King Diamond, Michael Denner entered a period that seemed quiet, but was full of the most important underlying movements of his career. He opened the Beatbox record shop in the middle of Copenhagen, a small store without flashy signage, but which gradually became a sanctuary for Danish vinyl collectors. It was the time when CDs began to dominate the market, and many people brought in boxes of old vinyl to sell at prices as cheap as giving them away. Michael quietly gathered them one by one, not for business, but out of fear that they would disappear from the world. No one expected that just a few decades later, those records people once saw as trash would become treasures. More than 30,000 copies, rare, valuable, all contained within a small shop that Denner considered his second home. During that time, music did not leave him. Together with Hank Shermann, he formed Lavina, later renamed Zoser Mez, a project full of dark, hard rock, but far freer than anything they had done before. No tour pressure, no expectations from labels, no mission to shock or surpass old milestones. Only two longtime friends finding their shared voice again through each riff and each harmony. The recording sessions of Lavina Zoser Mez carried the spirit of two artists returning to an old rehearsal room, picking up the pieces that life had forced them to abandon. It was this pure freedom that unintentionally created something no one predicted. One afternoon in 1991, King Diamond came to Michael's house for coffee. Denner and Hank played the newly recorded demos, just for fun, as they said. But when the melodies rang out, King looked at them, silent for a few seconds, then spoke a sentence that almost felt like destiny. "Sounds like merciful fate." It was not a compliment. It was like a lightning strike hitting the very history they once shared. In that moment, all three understood that something had not yet ended. A door that had slammed shut in 1985 was beginning to open on its own again. And from those quiet demos, from a small record shop tucked among the streets of Copenhagen, one of the most memorable reunions in metal history began to spark. Michael Denner, who seemed to have chosen to walk away from chaos and live an independent life, stepped once more into the current that fate still did not seem ready to let him escape. On evenings sitting in the beatbox shop, among the smell of old cardboard and the soft whirring of turntables, Michael had no thought that music was about to pull him back into the old vortex. But King's unexpected sentence, "Sounds like merciful fate," reopened the door he thought he had locked shut since 1985. And then, in 1992, the thing the metal community believed existed only in legend came true. Mercyful Fate reunited. In 1993, In the Shadows was born as a declaration that time could not dull their identity. The almost original lineup returned to the studio, and as a special mark, Lars Ulrich of Metallica, who had grown up with their music, appeared on drums for Return of the Vampire. The album was warmly welcomed by critics, not just because of the reunion, but because they truly wrote music as sharp as their old peak, yet more mature, deeper. Mercyful Fate did not simply revive. They returned as if they had never disappeared. In the years that followed, the stage burned once again. But behind the lights, things were far from smooth. Drummers changed constantly. Morten Nielsen had to leave the tour due to injury. Snowy Shaw replaced him. Then Snowy left, bringing Bjarne T. Holm into the final position. Timi Hansen, a longtime friend, refused long tours, and Charlie D'Angelo stepped in. Outwardly, Mercyful Fate looked like a powerful machine accelerating. Inside, it was a constantly patched-together ship, running more on persistence and willpower than stability. They continued making music. Time, 1994, initially disappointed Denner when he heard the demos. He bluntly called it horrible. But when the final version came out, everything had been refined to the point where even Denner nodded. It was a respectable work, with many beautiful moments. Into the Unknown, 1996, ventured into deeper darkness, and Dead, again, 1998, in Denner's own assessment, was their weakest album. He was not afraid to tell the truth, even when the truth was sharp enough to make fans pause. But then, the album 9, 1999, offered some recovery, darker, harder, and reminiscent of the spirit of their earliest days. It seemed as if everything had stabilized. The band still operated. Albums came regularly. Tours continued. But just at that moment, an event outside of music struck, placing Michael before a choice no artist ever wants to face. During his wife's first childbirth, severe complications occurred. She fractured her pelvis and faced the risk of lifelong disability. Michael stood between two paths: continue the crucial US-Europe tour with Mercyful Fate, or stay in Copenhagen to care for his wife and newborn child. It was no longer about music, no longer about glory or career. It was a question of family, responsibility, and love, things that stage lights could never replace. Michael chose family, and with that decision, he left Mercyful Fate for the second time. This time, not because of conflict or direction, but because his heart demanded he stay. Years later, he still called it one of the most painful decisions of his life, but also the choice that allowed him to remain himself. In that moment, a golden chapter closed, and tragedy, glory, responsibility, and love fused into a single silent mark that would never fade from Michael Denner's journey. After leaving Mercyful Fate for the second time, Michael Denner entered years that seemed gentler, but were in fact a period in which he quietly rebuilt himself. Without long tours or the tightened wire pace of a major band, Denner spent the next 2 decades walking smaller paths that were truer to who he was. He became a true independent artist, joining projects he felt connected to, not out of obligation. He went into the studio with Opera Diabolicus, a highly theatrical project where he stood alongside familiar names like Max, Andy LaRocque, and Snowy Shaw. Then came Cryptic, a form of dark but refined melodic blackened metal that matched his emotionally rich guitar style. When he wasn't holding a guitar, he became a freelance writer for metal magazines and organized monthly music quizzes to keep the community's flame alive. At times, he even sang evergreens, old ballads in the Sinatra style, joking that he would never become Denmark's Frank Sinatra. A charming image that revealed a soft-side metal fans rarely expected. The personal peak of this period came from a project that lasted 3 years, a documentary about the flying V guitar. Denner traveled everywhere to interview the legends he had once worshipped: Schenker, K.K. Downing, Dave Mustaine, James Hetfield, Kerry King. Their stories, memories, and philosophies were assembled by Denner as though he were building a shrine for the instrument that had followed him most of his life. The only one missing was Paul Stanley of Kiss, partly because of a Hawaiian vacation, partly because COVID-19 struck. But that absence merely added a somber note. For Denner, this was a milestone, not as a guitarist, but as a keeper of heritage. All those achievements suddenly felt small when 2019 arrived with a wound he never expected. Mercyful Fate announced a reunion. The entire metal community erupted. But for Michael Denner, it was the moment everything collapsed. He was not invited, not informed, not given a call, a message, not even the smallest explanation. I just woke up and realized this is no longer my band. The statement had no bitterness, no anger. It carried only the tone of a cold truth he was forced to accept. But the shock did not stop there. The real pain was that Hank Shermann, his companion of decades, the man who once said, "If we reunite, you have to be there," remained entirely silent. No explanation, no justification, no defense of his friend. That silence ended a friendship that had lasted since the late 70s. "He stabbed me in the back," Denner said. But with the reflex of someone long accustomed to wounds, he softened his own words. "I still love him, but I cannot trust him anymore." Then he saw the promotional video for the reunion tour. Old footage where he had always stood on the left side of the stage, now trimmed away so that no trace of him remained. As if history could be rewritten with a few editing cuts. "Ridiculous! Absurd! An insult to history!" he exclaimed. From that moment, Denner viewed Mercyful Fate's future with the eyes of someone who had weathered many storms. He believed the current King Diamond lineup was stronger than the MF reunion, and he believed King would eventually exhaust the reunion project before returning to his own band, where he had full control. A sharp perspective, unapologetic and unafraid to offend, but perhaps more important than anything was this. Even after being erased from the legacy he helped create, Michael Denner did not abandon music. He returned to his small record shop, kept selling vinyl, kept recording when invited, kept writing new melodies not meant to please anyone. As if amid all the fractures, music, the thing that once brought him into the spotlight and also tore him from his past, remained the one place that had never betrayed him. In the early 2000s, Michael, Hank Shermann, and Bjarne T. Holm formed Force of Evil, a project carrying the matured darkness of the two former Mercyful Fate members. If MF was ritualistic, Force of Evil was raw, more aggressive, unbound from old legacies. Here, Denner played as if he had nothing left to prove. Heavy riffs, harmonies full of depth, and a sense of freedom that attentive listeners could detect within seconds of each track. Yet the most defining project of this period was Denner R. Shermann, 2015-2016, the reunion of the two guitarists who had shaped the DNA code of Mercyful Fate. The EP Satan's Tomb and the album Masters of Evil were received by the metal community as Mercyful Fate in the form of two middle-aged souls. Not loud, not flashy, but deep, scarred, and containing a darkness matured through decades of collision. It was the last time the two stood side by side in the studio, and the last time before their relationship broke completely after the shock of the 2019 MF reunion. At the opposite end of the spectrum from metal, Denner revealed a completely different color through the project Denner's Trickbag. This was where he returned to his roots: blues rock, prog, fusion, the sound of the 70s, of Hendrix, Cream, Peter Green. Trickbag felt like a long exhale from an artist who had ventured too far into darkness and wanted to find the path that illuminated his essence again. In these songs, his guitar did not slash through darkness like in MF. It was softer, melodic, full of space. Like the young Denner sitting in a small Copenhagen room, hearing guitar through an old radio for the first time. The three projects, Force of Evil, Denner, Shermann, Denner's Trickbag, together formed a broader, more truthful portrait of Michael Denner, a man who refused to be confined by his own legacy. An artist who stepped out of heavy metal to find himself, then stepped back in, but never allowed his identity to be overshadowed by any name. Music had always been Michael Denner's lifeline, but the years away from Mercyful Fate made him realize something else. Not every battle is fought on stage. Behind the dim recording rooms and the noisy rehearsals, he returned to a small apartment where there were the soft footsteps of his wife and the breathing of a sleeping child. That world did not demand him to be sharp-edged, explosive, or a legend. There, he was simply a man trying to keep all his roles intact: husband, father, anchor. In the memories of those early family years, there were no spotlights, no tours, only nights when the whole family listened to old vinyl records together. The crackle of the vinyl blended with the babbling steps of his toddler, and Michael, the man who once shook Europe with razor-sharp twin guitars, felt his heart quiet every time he heard his wife call his name. Those simple moments had a pull that the grandest stages had never given him. Disaster struck just as Michael's career was shining brightest. His wife suffered complications during childbirth, fracturing her pelvis and facing the risk of lifelong disability. Standing in a cold, white hospital room, he faced the choice no one wants: continue the major scheduled tours, or stay beside the woman who could not sit up on her own and the newborn who had just cried for the first time. He did not say much about that moment, only admitted, "I felt pain in my chest," literally. And then he stayed. It meant leaving Mercyful Fate at the height of the band's power. If anyone asked whether he regretted it, Michael only gave a soft smile. No, but yes, it hurt. His wife recovered slowly. His son grew up with his father's steady presence. Michael sometimes still went to the record shop, still held his guitar during quiet nights, but deep down, he knew he had entered another chapter of life. A quieter one, but heavier than any album he had ever played on. At 17, his son decided to form a band of his own, not from pressure to follow his father's path, but from something as natural as breathing, just like the way young Michael once found his father's blues without anyone telling him to. He did not interfere with what genre his son played, what guitar he used, or who he wanted to become. The only thing he passed down was the philosophy that had carried him through a lifetime of music. Practice, practice, practice. There are no shortcuts, no magic, only your hands and your patience. Many thought the advice too simple for a legend, but for Michael, it was the most honest gift he could give. A full circle. From his father's blues nights to 6 rehearsals a week in Bratz, and now to his son playing guitar in a small bedroom, the sound flowing like a silent, powerful current between generations. Michael never said he wanted his son to become the next version of Denner. He only hoped the boy would find a sound that belonged to him, the way he himself had once found his own voice in the metal darkness of the 80s. And in his eyes, when he spoke of his son, there was a light no stage could provide, the light of a journey continuing, even if he was no longer standing at the center of the metal storm. When old wounds had healed and family became his most steadfast anchor, Michael entered a phase of life many would call old age, but in him it felt more like a quiet rebirth. No longer burdened by dense touring schedules or the collisions of reunions and breakups, he spent more time at home, with his wife, with his growing son, and with the music he still loved but no longer let rule his life. Perhaps from this peaceful foundation, a new Michael Denner began to emerge, gentler, freer, yet sharper than ever. In recent years, he has quietly been preparing for a new metal album, not to return, but to return to his essence. The sound he aims for is a bold fusion: classic-era Judas Priest, golden-era King Diamond, and the eerie quality of Mercyful Fate itself. The projected lineup is filled with heavy names: Jens Bagge, Chandler if schedules allow, Pete Black, Sean Peck. But what is most special is this. This time he does not want to be the band leader. He simply wants to hold a guitar and play. As a pure musician, with no burden, no pressure, and no manipulation from anyone's name. He still takes shows, still writes, still records guitar for projects he enjoys. Meanwhile, his beatbox shop has increasingly become a mini vinyl empire, revived powerfully thanks to his belief in something others once considered trash. The old records that were once sold off cheaply are now treasures, not only for their market value, but because each one is a fragment of memory from a man who has lived nearly his whole life with music. And looking back, it is hard to deny that Michael Denner's legacy has far surpassed what a non-spotlight-loving guitarist could ever hope for. Half of Mercyful Fate's DNA bears his mark. The razor-sharp twin harmonies, the haunting solos have deeply influenced black metal, thrash metal, power metal, and the Scandinavian metal generations that followed. The Flying V was once just a guitar, but in Denner's hands it became an icon. He did not show off, did not seek the spotlight, but with a single solo, anyone familiar with metal could recognize him. What people remember about him is not only the music, but the man behind it. Humble, honest, more loyal to family and music than fame. Someone often pulled into conflicts he never started. An artist who paid the price but never lost his decency. When a nearly half-century-long journey ends with a single quiet note, it leaves a question each listener must face on their own. If you had to choose again, follow glory or stay with the ones you love, what would you choose? A question that needs no answer, only for you to pause and listen to yourself. Michael Denner's journey may make each person stop at a different point. A story, a choice, a turning moment that touches something we have lived through. Tell me what part touched you. Sometimes a single line of reflection is enough to deepen the story. And if you want to continue traveling through the journeys where music and fate intertwine in unpredictable ways, hit like and subscribe. We will meet again in stories not only to hear, but to feel.